tastes like product placement. What's up, everybody, and welcome back to Sounds Good Makes Sense, a discussion show for the World of Warcraft player. My name is Devilor, and today we're going to talk about the story mode addition to the War Within and what that means for both storytelling in WoW, but also raiding in WoW. But first, I have an announcement to make. The Sounds Good Makes Sense merch store is finally available. That is a real easy website as well. It's just devilor.com. You can just head right over there and you'll see all of the products. The site is live right now. You can go and check it out. I had a lot of people a while ago asking, hey, when are you going to have some SGMS merch? So the answer is now. Now I have some SGMS merch. There's a whole bunch of cool stuff available, including like this Sounds Good Makes Sense mug that you saw in the intro. And there are two sizes of this mug. This is the taller one because I like to drink a lot of coffee. There are glasses such as this can-shaped Sounds Good glass, which is great. Let's see, there is this sticker set, and these are huge, by the way. Those are like the size of my hand size on those stickers. There's shirts like this one that I'm currently wearing. There's a couple other varieties of shirts as well. There is this really cool hoodie that has this massive Sounds Good logo on the back of it. And that is a zip-up hoodie, so it's extra comfy. I prefer zip-up hoodies as much as possible. And there's also, obviously, this hat. And this is an embroidered hat, by the way. I don't know if you can really see it all that clearly in the video, but that is actually stitched into the hat. It's an amazing hat. I'm actually so happy about this hat. It like fits my head. I don't even have to have it on the last pip. I have a huge head. I don't even have to have it on the last pip. It's great. Obviously, I'm going to say that because this is my merch store that's just launching, but I've been really, really pleased with all the samples of the different products that I've gotten so far. And I really like it. I'm really excited about it. Hopefully you all are too. You can head over once again to devilor.com to check that out. As an added bonus, if you are a patron or a Twitch subscriber, you can get 15% off of everything on the store. Patrons, you'll need to go over to patreon.com/devilor and look through there, or you can go into the Discord as well. There's instructions in there on how to access the 15% discount code. And patrons also have an access to a special version of the hoodie that has the word patron down the sleeve. It's really cool. It's basically the same hoodie. It just says patron on it. It's like an extra like cool thing you can decide to get if you're a patron and you want that. And Twitch subscribers, like I said, Twitch subscribers also get 15% off. That's just done directly by logging into your Twitch account as part of the checkout process. There is a weird glitch with the site right now, by the way, where it's saying 15% off for everyone, even though it is just that is the Twitch subscriber benefit that's showing. I'm talking to the developer of the site trying to get that fixed. But in the meantime, if you want that 15% off, patreon.com/devilor or subscribe on Twitch, and you can get access to a nice little extra bit of, like, you could actually theoretically save yourself money depending on how much merch you want to order, which is all of it. Please go order all of the merch. That would be very cool. But okay, enough selling myself out for one episode. Let's get into the topic at hand, which is the recently data mined and then slightly discussed story mode raids being added to the War Within, beginning with the Nerubar Palace, which is the first raid of the expansion. So this got data mined in, I don't remember if it was the most recent build or the build before, but it was data mined relatively recently. WoW had put an article up about it, which then prompted a blue post on the WoW forums where they gave a little bit more details about what exactly this means. So they indicated that it's going to be for a private party of 1 through 5 players. And I think what they mean by private party there is just that there isn't matchmaking. It's literally you and whoever you have intentionally invited to come along with you to this story mode raid. You're not going to get thrown in with a bunch of other randos in the process. They said that it's basically a slimmed down like version of the Queen Ansurek encounter, which is the final boss of the raid instance. And it's one that's been slimmed down dramatically enough to basically just be a story mode version of the encounter. It's not meant to be like difficult in any sense from how I'm gathering what this is how it's being talked about. That was a meal of a sentence. From what I'm gathering, it's not meant to be a difficult encounter. It's just meant to basically be go in there and see the conclusion to the story of the Azj-Kahet storyline or quest storyline. They also said it's going to be released with the final wing of LFR, as long as you've reached the appropriate point in the quest line. So as long as you've done all of the AK quests, the Azj-Kahet quests, then you will be able to access this once it is actually released. And there's a couple things that they didn't directly say in the post. So I'm kind of just inferring here, but I think they're very fair inferments. Is that the word? They're fair things to assume based on the way that this is being talked about. One of those that I think is pretty obvious is that they didn't directly say it's only the last boss, but it's pretty heavily implied that it's only the Queen Ansurek encounter. It's literally just that final boss. That's what we're assuming is the case based on the way they were talking about this in the post. They also didn't directly say that there isn't any loot, but they did say something that makes it very much sound like that, which was that it's, quote, intended to be experienced as a one-time chapter in the game's story, but is repeatable if you want. To me, that means it's like they would say, the way they say is repeatable if you want implies to me that, yeah, you can go back and do it, but only really if you want to. There's not really a reward for it, which means that there probably isn't any loot, which means that it's probably just something that, like they said, you go and you do it once just to see the conclusion of the story, and now you've done it. Congratulations. Now, the obvious comparison here, and one that they made in the post as well, is to Follower Dungeons, which is a more recent addition to the game also that was added in one of the more recent, I forget exactly which Dragonflight patch that was added in, but one of the more recent ones in Dragonflight, where you are able to queue up and go through a dungeon with basically just a bunch of NPCs as your party members instead of having to group up with other players. They're really just trying to find ways to allow people to experience this content and allow people to experience the story specifically of what's going on in these dungeons, what's going on in these raids, without having to get into group content, without having to, I forget exactly how they phrased it, but engage in that social element of grouping up with other players. I'm going to come back to that one. To start with examining this whole thing, I want to start by looking at what it is, like what we know about it so far and how we expect that gameplay to actually play out. Like it very much seems like the intention here is you quest through Azj-Kahet, you get to the end, you're now basically at the point where it's like, yeah, we got to go take down Queen Ansurek, or however that concludes. I actually don't remember exactly how that concludes, even though I did that quest line in the alpha. At the point where it's like, it's time to go take down Ansurek, and you're like, great, cool, awesome. I guess I'm going to wait 2 months for that to release. Like, obviously, it's very likely, in fact, that there's going to be some like campaign unlockable content at max level. So it's probably not literally a case of wait 2 months until this new story, the conclusion of the story becomes available. There's probably going to be some campaign quests that come out that are like, yeah, okay, here's the next step towards completing it. Here's the next step toward completing it. And then once you've gotten all those done, my assumption is that that's the point when you would unlock access to this story mode raid, which could in turn means that the timing works out where it's like, okay, yeah, it's been that long. You've done all these weekly campaign quests up until this point, and now you can go into the dungeon. In which case, then that's cool. Like that makes sense to me. It is still awkward, the fact that, like, if you are not just doing the story mode content, if you're a progression, if you're just even doing normal mode raids, you've probably already killed Ansurek by the time you get to the point of the story where you need to kill Ansurek. So that whole like spacing out of content still is causing some weirdness inside the way that this story is told inside of the game. In some fashion or other, there's gonna be something weird about it by having that essentially delay before this comes out for the story. But like I said, that's been a problem for kind of a while in WoW, and this is at least a better situation than it was before. There's also the question of how much of the story can you actually glean from this raid instance if the only encounter you get to see is the final one. And there's a bunch of different ways that could go. Obviously, in a lot of previous raids, there have been cinematics even prior to the final encounter. I'm going to assume that because this is working out this way, they're probably really only doing much in the way of cinematic storytelling at the end of the raid dungeon. And that's usually been the case for first raid tiers of an expansion also. It's usually the case where, yeah, you get to the end of this and there's a bit of story, there's a story beat at the end of that, but most of the story took place outside of the raid. So I'm not overly worried about that for this implementation. I would expect that if we get future raids where there's like key cinematic moments that occur throughout the story of the raid, that we then have multi-encounter story mode raids, even if it's only like literally the ones that have the cinematics attached to them. Theoretically could be the case. But there is also then the question of like, okay, yeah, not everything has a cinematic though. Like, are you going to encounter bosses inside the Nerubar Palace raid that are NPCs you were interacting with while you were questing, or things that were occurring inside the Azj-Kahet zone as well? And again, I have done the AK quest line in the alpha, and looking through the list of bosses again, having done that now, went back and looked through the list of bosses that are in the Nerubar Palace raid. There are some in there that I kind of expect are going to connect in some way or another I don't remember the name of every single NPC, but there are some in there that go, okay, yeah, that reminds me of this NPC. That reminds me of this NPC. I suspect there will be some connections that are made. And so there will be some like side stories of Azj-Kahet that are likely reaching their conclusion, or at least some new step in that story as part of the Nerubar Palace raid. So it is still likely that just having done the questing zone and then the story mode raid, but you'll probably still miss out on at least some context of some other things that have occurred. But again, this is still an improvement over the previous situation for players who wanted to experience the story of World of Warcraft, but didn't want to join an organized raiding guild. And LFR has really never been any good at actually telling the story of what's going on. So it's still at least an improvement over the previous situation, in which case I'm all for it. Now, I know someone somewhere is going to say, but Devilor, it's an MMORPG. Everyone should have to group to each other all the time. First of all, please speak more clearly. That's a strange voice. I know that's not your natural voice. Please stop doing that when you're trying to make a point. But secondly, I don't know. It's important to recognize that storytelling and the storytelling experience inside WoW, and in fact, in a lot of MMORPGs that have been like highly regarded for their storytelling. I'm thinking about games like Final Fantasy XIV or Star Wars: The Old Republic right now. A lot of those games, the storytelling experience is almost entirely single player. The vast majority of the story that you're being told is in quests and things that you almost certainly are doing by yourself. Like, yes, you can technically group with other people while you're questing and experience the story together, but I think that's very much the exception rather than the rule. The vast majority of MMORPG players are experiencing the story of what's going on through the entire lead up period as solo questing. That's how it's entirely getting done. So in that way, like the gameplay hook, the gameplay that essentially occurs to me is similar to if you were playing, I don't know, Alan Wake or The Last of Us or something like that. And then when you get to the finale, it just pops up with a screen that says looking for others, and then throws you into a group with 19 other people who are all just there to get it done. And they're probably already mad at you because you're not doing something correctly because they expect everyone to already have done it and so on. Like that's been the storytelling experience in World of Warcraft. If you're not a progression raider or even like doing things on normal or higher, that's been your entire storytelling experience. Is you do a whole bunch of stuff solo. And then once you get to the end, once you get to the point of the story where it's time to find out what this has all been building up to, you got a group with 19 randos to do it. And as Blizzard continues to make advances and improvements to the way that they are telling stories inside of World of Warcraft, things like the in-game cutscenes and the little cinematics that happen, the ones that are actually involving your character walking around, being part of the story and so on, as it becomes a more and more immersive storytelling experience, especially, like, I don't think there's any universe in which immersive storytelling and 19 randos who just want to get it done, those don't mix. Honestly, maybe this is a hot take, but I don't even think immersive storytelling and progression rating can mix. There's just way too much that sort of takes you out of the immersion when you're trying to defeat bosses, when you're trying to figure out and learn strategies, and you're wiping multiple times, and then you eventually manage to get it down. And then it's like, okay, great. Now let's spend 10 minutes discussing where all this loot is going to go. And then we move on through the trash, and then we get on to the next boss, and everyone go watch a video to figure out what we're supposed to do on this next boss. And like, or, you know, if you're completely at the mythic cutting edge level, like you're learning it all yourself. Like there's just so much that is immersion breaking about that I don't really think there can be immersive storytelling inside that environment. Is taking what would otherwise be this progression rating, like large group experience, and turning it into a single player thing the perfect solution? Probably not. There's theoretically other ways that it could be done, but I don't know that any of those are the perfect solution either. And I think this is a good way to go about it. Let the rating still be rating. Let that all still exist in the way that it needs to, and let it have these story hooks attached to it. Just make sure that those story hooks are accessible to people that don't want to join a raid guild, especially when the only other opportunity is join an LFR and just see the content, but you probably don't understand what's going on anyway because everyone's just shouting at each other in the chat the entire time and it's a complete mess. Like, having some way for you to have to take your almost entirely solo experience and complete that story of your almost entirely solo experience with a solo instance, that feels like at least a good solution to the problem, if not a perfect one. But speaking of LFR, one of the big questions I've seen people starting to ask about this is this a replacement for LFR? Will this Like, will Blizzard eventually, obviously we know at this point, it's been data mined, there already is a raid finder version of the Nerubar Palace. So there isn't like an impending removal of raid finder. There isn't like, they're not deleting LFR for the first tier. They even said in their post that they're going to release it along with the last wing of raid finder. So we're not talking about anything like immediate. This isn't a first patch, all of a sudden LFR is gone sort of situation, but it has been bringing up the question, and it's a reasonable one, of, is this a direction where, if this story mode rating works out, will Blizzard eventually consider removing LFR as a result? And I think that's possible, but unlikely. I'm very much a maybe, but probably not reaction to that answer. And here's the reason for it. People love to say, like, oh, LFR ruined raiding. Like, oh my God, I can't believe once they added raid finder to the game, that's when raiding went downhill, because just anybody could do it and people didn't want to strive anymore. And then raid finder turned out to be a mess and blah, 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 like all these other things. And while there are certainly issues with raid finder, I personally, there are things that I don't like to do raid finder. It's not something that I want to do, even as someone who is also not currently in at least not in a retail raiding guild. I don't have any interest in doing raid finder. So I'm not here to defend raid finder as it is currently implemented. But what I will say is that I feel very confident that if it wasn't for LFR, we would probably not have progression rating anymore. Or at the very least, we would have a significantly diminished version of progression rating than what we actually have, with a ton more like reused assets and rehashed boss fights and balance issues and all other things that would occur as a result of it. And the reason I say that is that it all starts from the you have to understand, building a raid takes a ton of effort, and it takes that effort on the entire team. Like, not just from the perspective of the stuff that is needed directly for the raid. Like, that is still also a lot of work. You've got to build the environments, you got to build the enemies, you got to model them, animate them, so on and so forth. There's all the textures that need to be done for all of this stuff. The animations, like I said, you need to create the boss mechanics and to build the boss arenas. And that usually then also involves some more art and stuff that needs to be done to match the spell effects of the bosses that are having these abilities and so on. You need to put all the loot in there. You need to make sure all that loot is thematically appropriate for what's going on in the raid. There's the cinematics. There's like UI stuff that has to be done for each new raid. There's a lot of work that just goes into literally making the raid. On top of that, because the raid exists, there's a bunch of extra work that the rest of the team then gets affected by. That it causes this ripple effect throughout the entire design of the game. Because obviously, as you're designing these raids, you're designing these encounters. Oh God, these encounters are now built in such a way that we need to do some class balance changes in order to make sure that everybody is on a level playing field going through this raid. And those class balance changes will continue to happen throughout the entire raid tier. And as those class balance changes go into place, like that sometimes affects art in some ways. That sometimes causes people okay, now because of the way things went in this raid tier, we need to redesign these couple of abilities for this class. And anytime you're touching class balance, you're now also touching PvP balance. So the people who are focused on PvP, literally work is created for the PvP team by virtue of the raids existing. Like, it's just important to understand the entire team has work that has to be done as a result of a raid existing. It's a massive undertaking putting these things together. And if only a small percentage of players are even experiencing that content, like if we look at normal or above, right? We say anyone who's at least doing normal mode difficult, anything above LFR, normal mode difficulty or higher, I would be surprised if that's more than 20% of the player base. I don't know those numbers, and I haven't known those numbers in a long time, but I would be surprised, genuinely surprised, if more than 20% of the WoW player base is participating in normal or above raid content. So if you're building content that requires all of this work from pretty much 100% of the team, and you're doing it for 20% of the players, there's going to start to be questions, especially for a major corporation that has been doing layoffs recently, remind you. There's going to start to be those questions of, is that effort worth it? Or should we put all these people on other things or do the major corporation thing and lay them all off? And neither of those results mean that raid content gets to be produced for the people that want hardcore raiding content. So the solution that Blizzard came up with all the way back in the Dragon Soul days, all the way back in Cataclysm, was let's make a version of this raid that is now accessible to everyone. Let's make content that is able to be, let's make it so that the vast majority of the work that goes into making this raid exist is work that is being put towards 100% of the player base. And obviously not 100% of the player base is still going to participate in LFR, right? It's not, there's a lot of people that still don't even do LFR, but it's at least now a much wider part of the player base that has access to this content. It's stuff that they are then able to do, as opposed to previously, like, let's get 100% of the team working on something that only 20% of the player base is going to see. That's a difficult one to get C-suite executives to sign off on. It's much easier to then say, okay, well, we're going to do all this work, but we're going to do all this work anyway because it's content for everyone. And then the little bit of extra stuff where we make the bosses have a few more mechanics, or we, add a few more spell effects here and so on, or we need to do a little bit more class tweaking as a result of how things work out at the higher end of things. All the rest of the work still needed to be done to make this content that's available to everyone. It's now that the 20% extra work that's going towards the 20% of the player base. And that's fine. Like that seems reasonable. But because of all that, I still think LFR needs to exist. I still think if it isn't for the fact that there is I'm just going to hop in and queue for a raid and plow through it in 30 minutes and then I'm done version of this content, I think it would be difficult for Blizzard to justify continuing to create it in the face of who knows what else they could be doing with their time. Or again, just laying off a bunch of people, because that's apparently what corporations do these days. But story mode existing does mean that Blizzard has the opportunity to refine the LFR experience. When you're no longer trying to have LFR serve essentially double duty as I just want to hop in and clear through this in half an hour, or I have no idea what's going on and I'm just here as a tourist to see what's happening. When it no longer needs to appeal to both of those player bases, when the story mode takes over that tourist experience, that means that then they can start to refine the LFR experience for players who do just want to, like, yeah, I want to do a raid. I want to do some large group content, but I want to do it on my schedule when I have available time. If I have a half an hour to do a wing of LFR, I just want to hop on WoW, queue for that, do it, and then be done. They can then begin to actually build the LFR experience with explicitly that player in mind, instead of having to worry as much about the player who is just there and has no idea what's going on. I don't necessarily think that means they need to make LFR hard out of nowhere or anything like that. But at the very least means that now they can look at the player who is, like, probably an alt, or somebody who at least has been doing like Mythic Plus or something, someone who is engaged enough in this content to understand what's going on, and they can turn LFR into something that is more accessible and more exactly what that player is looking for. Heck, even with the warband stuff coming out, there might be some cool ways that they could work with the warband system to make LFR more useful. I just think the fact that they are separating out the just here for the story aspect from the target audience for LFR does actually help quite a bit with making them and giving them the opportunity to make LFR a fun and engaging experience for the people that want to do it. The second big question that comes to mind about this whole story mode experience thing is, how does this apply to story that's being told outside of the game? Like, it's been a long-standing complaint about World of Warcraft that, especially for some expansions, like, if you didn't read the book, you don't know what's going on. If you didn't go read this short story, you have no idea who this character is or why you care what they're up to. That's been a thing that people have been talking about for World of Warcraft for a long time. There's books, short story, hell, even other games. Like, if you didn't play Warcraft 3, you probably didn't understand most of what was going on in the Wrath of the Lich King expansion. And that's genuinely a problem. That said, I don't think the answer is to, like, limit all WoW storytelling, limit all World of Warcraft or all Warcraft in general storytelling to just be single player World of Warcraft content. There's so many different ways to tell stories, and embracing all of that and doing it well, I think, is the way to go about it. In fact, I don't even think having story content that is unique to group content in World of Warcraft is a bad thing. I don't think it would be bad at all to have something that's like, yes, this is group only content, and there is a story that is told inside of it that's unique to that group story content. The key word there is unique. Like I was saying earlier, the problem that story mode is trying to solve is the fact that you have an almost entirely single player story experience that then leads up to a point where, just to find out the last bit of what happens in that single player story, you have to join a group. The nature of how you're being told the same story is changing at the last moment. Then that's been problems in the past with books and stuff as well, where, like, again, there's this character that you're just supposed to know who they are, but if you haven't read this book or whatever, you don't know what's going on. Heck, the entire premise of the Warlords of Draenor expansion, the entire lead up of why the heck this thing even occurred in the first place, that all took place in a book with involving some characters, some of which never really even appeared in World of Warcraft at all. It was like, okay, you kind of eventually come across this guy, and there was like this little quest that involved Chromie at some point that tried to explain like some of what happened before, but the whole thing was very confusing in how it ended up working out, because it was very clearly the expectation was, if you want to super follow the story, you've read this book and then started playing the expansion. So I think it's largely just a matter of making sure that when you start to tell a story thread, when there is a plot that is occurring in the game, keep all of that in the game accessible in a similar manner to how you were experiencing the majority of it, right? If you start a story using a single player quest, you should expect to end that story using single player content as well. You should be able to get the entire story with at least enough of the context to know what's going on in it and not be confused about like, who the heck is this guy and why does anyone care who they are? You should be able to understand as much of that as possible from a single player perspective if you are starting that story being told from single player content. I also think timing is somewhat important on this. Like, I don't actually have a problem with the concept of, hey, there was this unexplained kind of weird thing that happened, you know, a couple expansions or even a couple content patches ago that we never really got the conclusion of what's going on there. We never really got to see where that story ended up. There was just these couple of characters that spun up some side thing and then we never heard from them again. That sort of thing happens in WoW all the time. I don't have a problem at all with that sort of thing being like, okay, let's go and explore what these two characters were up to. Let's do that in a short story. Let's do that in another video game. Let's set something up so that we can have, I was talking about this in Search of Answers a few weeks ago. Let's spin up a side story inside World of Warcraft with a couple characters that then branches out into a like single player God of War style game or something like that. That's really meant to be an immersive story experience start to finish. But we can have that be set up at some point and then come back to that later to really tell what that story is. The key is just that the story still has to make sense in the manner of which it's being told. So if you're going to queue up this side thing, it needs to be very clear that these guys are going off somewhere else and that is the end of their part in this story. They're not going to like show up back again later and be like, hey, here we are with the MacGuffin. We solved all the problem. And you're like, okay, but how? And then you have to go read a short story in order to determine what that is. And I genuinely think that if you're not trying to push that side story out at the same time that you're doing this quest chain or whatever, you will then naturally, as a storyteller, feel the need to include more of the details in things somehow, or change the details in such a way that it makes more sense to be like less of an individual thing, in such a way that now it's actually at least a cohesive story. Yes, maybe there's some unsolved mysteries here and there, and those can be explored at a later time, but make sure that the main plot, the core of it the whole way through, is something that can be understood and followed by someone who's just playing the video game. And honestly, all of these side stories and stuff, they don't need to be teed up inside the game either. Like, there's a whole world of Warcraft. There's a whole world going on in Azeroth. There could be anything occurring anywhere else at any point in time in World of Warcraft. Like, just because, like, in the War Within, we're now we're going to the Isle of Dorn, we're going down deeper inside the core of Azeroth, and we're finding the Nerubians and all that. That doesn't mean every story told about Warcraft for the foreseeable future needs to be about the Isle of Dorn and the Nerubians and all of that. Like, there can be stories that are being told about a dude that just lives in Goldshire and walked into Goldshire in one day and his whole worldview changed. Actually, probably don't tell that story, but there could be anything else that's going on anywhere else inside the Warcraft mythos at any moment in time. It doesn't all have to tie into whatever the current WoW expansion happens to be. But that gets into this whole other rant about world building that's going to be a whole other topic for another video about the way that world building has been approached in WoW for quite some time. I'm not going to get into that today. For this video, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up here. Thank you all so much for watching. Please, if you have any thoughts on anything, please keep those comments coming. I love seeing all the comments and all the different perspectives. I'm very much someone who, when I see someone else's perspective on something, I want to understand why that is. Why do you think that way? What am I missing? What am I not thinking of that you have thought of, or where is the gap in communication and so on? I love seeing all the alternate viewpoints, even if they're disagreeing with what I have to say. So please keep those comments coming. Also, if you have any questions that you would like me to answer on this or any topic, you can just leave a comment with that question, and I'll try to get to it in my show In Search of Answers, which comes out every Monday. Also, reminder, my store is live. You can go buy this shirt. Well, not this one specific. This one's mine. You can't have this one, but you can go buy a shirt that looks and feels exactly like this one. Or maybe it's in a different site. You know what I'm talking about. It's a merch store. You can go to the merch store, devillore.com. Please go check that out and give a look at all of that. Reminder that both patrons and Twitch subscribers can get a 15% discount. Twitch subscribers get that by linking their account to the shop page, which is really easy. When you go to checkout, there's a button you click that links your Twitch account. Patrons, you need to use a coupon code or a promotional code. That promotional code can be found both in the patrons only section of my Discord, as well as on the Patreon site itself, patreon.com/devillore. You can go over there and check that out. And there is a patron specific version of that hoodie that if you're interested in having a super fancy one that only patrons get access to, that is available over there. Anyway, I have done more than enough advertising my own stuff in this particular episode. Thank you all so much once again for watching. I'm out of here. See you later.